In the winter of 1879, contractors arrived at the abandoned Sunset Years Christian home in Hartford, Connecticut, to begin renovations. What they discovered there would haunt the city for decades to come. Beneath the floorboards of the medical wing, wrapped in moth-eaten burial shrouds, lay hidden 23 leather-bound ledgers. These contained the most meticulous records of systematic murder ever found in New England. Inside each page were detailed names, dates, methods, and the monetary gains from what investigators would later call the most calculated slaughter of innocents in American history. For 34 years, Dr. William Porter, his wife Margaret, and her sister Sarah had operated this Christian home for the elderly. According to these blood-stained records, they had methodically murdered 189 residents, stealing over $3 million in inheritances. So shocking was the level of premeditation and greed revealed by the ledgers that Hartford authorities suppressed the full details for nearly a century. They feared the truth would destroy the public's faith in Christian charity forever. But before we continue with the story of the Porter family and their house of horrors, I need to tell you something important. This channel isn't for everyone. It is only for the bravest souls, those who dare to uncover the darkest secrets hidden in America's past. The stories we tell here are ones few channels dare to tell. They reveal the true depths of human evil, often disguised as Christian charity. If you've made it this far, you're not like most people. You are one of the select few who can handle these dark mysteries. Subscribe now. Hit that notification bell and comment below, telling us what state or city you're listening from. We want to know how far these stories reach our brotherhood of mystery hunters. Now, let's discover what really happened behind the sacred walls of the Sunset Years Christian home. But the true horror of the Porter family's crimes wasn't just in the numbers. It was in the methodical, almost loving way they documented each murder, as if their work was something to be proud of. During the 1840s, Hartford, Connecticut was a city caught between its Puritan past and an uncertain industrial future. Prosperity was brought by the Connecticut River through shipping and manufacturing. But a new kind of problem arrived with it. These were wealthy elderly residents with no family left to care for them. The old Puritan tradition of family responsibility was crumbling as young people moved west, leaving their aging parents behind with fortunes but no heirs. Dominating Hartford's spiritual landscape, the Congregationalist churches had always emphasized charitable works. But an unprecedented challenge was presented by the growing population of isolated elderly. It was into this void that Dr. William Porter stepped in 1845, presenting himself as the answer to Christian Hartford's prayers. A tall, distinguished man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes was Dr. Porter. Both wisdom and compassion seemed to be conveyed by his gaze. He had studied medicine at Yale and served as a field surgeon during the Mexican-American War, experiences that had given him an intimate knowledge of both healing and death. His wife Margaret was equally impressive, a trained nurse who had worked in Boston's charity hospitals before their marriage. Completing their trinity of caretakers was her sister Sarah, a stern but seemingly devoted woman who had dedicated her life to Christian service after losing her husband to typhoid fever. Together, they established the Sunset Years Christian home on Prospect Avenue, in a sprawling Victorian mansion converted from a failed boarding house. On 2 acres of manicured gardens sat the 3-story building, complete with a small chapel for residents to attend daily prayers. More than just a home for the elderly was how the Porters marketed their establishment. It was a Christian sanctuary where the wealthy could spend their final years in comfort, surrounded by godly caretakers who would ensure their souls were prepared for the eternal journey ahead. Quickly through Hartford's Congregationalist community, the home's reputation spread. Regularly to parishioners struggling with elderly relatives, Reverend Samuel Whitmore of the First Church of Christ recommended the Porters. The cost was steep, $200 per month, which was more than most working families earned in a year. But for Hartford's merchant elite, peace of mind seemed a small price to pay. Particularly attractive was the Porters' willingness to accept residents regardless of their mental state. With open arms, the Porters welcomed those showing signs of senility or confusion, while other institutions turned them away. Revolutionary treatments for mental decline had been developed by Dr. Porter, he claimed, combining Christian prayer with modern medicine to provide comfort in life's final chapter. The home's daily routine reflected its religious foundation. At 6 a.m., residents woke for morning prayers in the chapel, followed by breakfast in the communal dining room. Each morning, Dr. Porter conducted medical examinations while Margaret supervised the nursing staff and Sarah managed the home's financial affairs. Afternoon activities included Bible study, letter writing, and peaceful walks through the gardens. Each day was concluded with evening prayers, with residents retiring to their private rooms by 9 p.m. From the outside, the Sunset Years Christian home appeared to be everything it claimed, a Christian oasis where the elderly could live out their final years in dignity and comfort. Visitors were always impressed by the cleanliness, the devoted staff, and the obvious contentment of the residents. What they couldn't see was the careful calculation behind every smile, every prayer, and every act of apparent kindness. The truth was that from the very beginning, the Porters had never intended to simply care for the elderly. They had created the perfect environment for something far more sinister. A place had been made where wealthy, isolated individuals could be systematically exploited and murdered with no one to question their methods or mourn their victims. On a bitter February morning in 1847 came the first sign that something was terribly wrong at the Sunset Years Christian home, though its true significance would not be understood for decades. Mrs. Abigail Thornton, a 73-year-old widow whose husband had made a fortune in the shipping trade, had been a resident for only 3 weeks when she began exhibiting troubling symptoms. According to the official records, Mrs. Thornton had been in excellent health when she arrived, complaining only of loneliness and mild arthritis. Her daughter lived in California, and her son had died in a carriage accident the previous year, leaving her completely alone with an estate worth nearly $50,000. Specifically because of its reputation for Christian compassion and medical expertise, she had chosen the Sunset Years Christian home. But on that February morning, Mrs. Thornton was found in her room by Margaret Porter, barely conscious and mumbling incoherently about the angels coming to take her home. Severely dilated were her pupils, her breathing was shallow, and she seemed unable to recognize anyone around her. Immediately, Dr. Porter was summoned, and after a brief examination, he announced that Mrs. Thornton was suffering from a sudden decline in mental faculties, a condition he claimed to have observed frequently in elderly patients. What happened next established a pattern that would be repeated 188 more times over the following 32 years. A strong dose of morphine was prescribed by Dr. Porter to ease her suffering, explaining to the concerned staff that Mrs. Thornton was clearly experiencing great distress and that Christian mercy demanded they help her find peace. Personally, Margaret Porter administered the injection, and within hours, Mrs. Thornton had slipped into a coma. For 3 days, Mrs. Thornton lingered between life and death while the Porters maintained their vigil. Constantly they prayed over her, held her hand, and spoke softly about the eternal rest that awaited her. To the staff and the few visitors who inquired about her condition, they presented themselves as devoted caretakers, doing everything possible to comfort a suffering soul. On the 4th day, Mrs. Thornton died peacefully in her sleep. Natural decline due to advanced age and mental deterioration was listed as the cause of death. Himself, being both the attending physician and the owner of the facility, Dr. Porter signed the death certificate. There was no autopsy, no investigation, and no questions asked by Hartford authorities. After all, in a home for the elderly, death was an expected outcome. But what made Mrs. Thornton's death particularly significant was what happened in the days immediately following her passing. Sarah Porter, who handled all administrative matters for the home, approached the staff with a heartbreaking story. She explained that in her final moments of clarity, Mrs. Thornton had expressed deep gratitude for the care she had received and had asked Sarah to ensure that her estate would be used to continue the home's Christian mission. A handwritten document supposedly dictated by Mrs. Thornton and witnessed by Dr. Porter and Margaret was produced by Sarah. In it, Mrs. Thornton left her entire estate to the Sunset Years Christian home with the exception of a small bequest to her daughter in California. In Sarah's distinctive handwriting, the document was written, but she explained that Mrs. Thornton had been too weak to write it herself and had asked Sarah to serve as her scribe. With the Hartford probate court, the supposed will was filed, and since Mrs. Thornton had no local family to contest it, the estate passed to the Porters without challenge. Within weeks, They had liquidated Mrs. Thornton's assets and deposited the proceeds into the home's accounts. The facility was expanded, additional staff were hired, and the home's reputation as a premier Christian institution was enhanced with the money. To anyone observing from the outside, the entire sequence of events appeared perfectly normal. An elderly woman had died peacefully in the care of devoted Christian caretakers, and in gratitude, she had left her estate to ensure that other elderly individuals could receive the same compassionate care. It was exactly the kind of Christian charity that Hartford's religious community expected and admired. But in the hidden ledgers that wouldn't be discovered for another 32 years, the truth was recorded in Dr. Porter's meticulous handwriting. Mrs. A. Thornton. Morphine overdose administered February 15, 1847. Inheritance secured, $47,300. Method refined for future subjects. Note: gradual introduction of morphine over several days creates appearance of natural decline. Staff suspects nothing. Community response positive. The ledgers revealed that from the moment she arrived at the home, Mrs. Thornton's death had been planned. The Porters had carefully studied her financial situation, confirmed her lack of local family, and then systematically drugged her with small doses of morphine until she appeared to be suffering from mental decline. Once she was sufficiently incapacitated, they increased the dosage to fatal levels while maintaining the appearance of compassionate care. Just one part of their elaborate scheme was the forged will. The Porters had studied Mrs. Thornton's handwriting from letters in her possession, practiced reproducing her signature, and created a document that would pass casual inspection by probate authorities. They had even researched her daughter's situation in California, ensuring that the bequest was small enough to discourage her from traveling to Hartford to contest the will. Particularly chilling was the religious framework they used to justify and conceal their actions. By presenting themselves as devout Christians providing mercy to the suffering, they had created the perfect cover for systematic murder. With prayers, every injection of morphine was administered. As the dying wish of a grateful soul, every forged document was presented. And as a gift to continue God's work, every stolen inheritance was justified. That they had discovered the perfect crime was convinced of the Porters by the success of their first murder. They had proven that elderly people could be killed with impunity if the method was gradual enough and the religious justification was convincing enough. More importantly, they had demonstrated that massive inheritances could be stolen without arousing suspicion if the victims were isolated and the caretakers were trusted members of the Christian community. Mrs. Abigail Thornton's death wasn't just a murder. It was the first successful test of a system that would claim 188 more lives over the next 3 decades. And as Dr. Porter noted in his final entry about her case, method proven effective. Expansion of operations recommended. The Lord has provided us with a most profitable mission. The beginning of a carefully orchestrated reign of terror that would continue for over 3 decades was marked by the death of Mrs. Thornton, though the full scope of the Porters' crimes wouldn't become apparent until much later. In the months following her death, the atmosphere at the Sunset Years Christian home began to change in subtle but significant ways. Staff members noticed that Dr. Porter had become more selective about the residents he would accept. Where once he had welcomed anyone who could afford the monthly fee, he now insisted on conducting extensive interviews, not just with potential residents, but with their families as well. To ensure that each resident would receive the most appropriate care for their specific needs was his claim. But far more sinister was his real purpose. From their experience with Mrs. Thornton, the Porters had learned that successful murders required careful planning and the right type of victim. They needed residents who were wealthy, isolated, and vulnerable to manipulation. Most importantly, they needed people whose deaths would be accepted without question by the community. The role of chief investigator was taken on by Margaret Porter, using her nursing background to assess each potential resident's health and life expectancy. A sophisticated system for evaluating candidates was developed by her, considering factors such as their mental state, their family relationships, their financial assets, and their social connections. Only those who met her strict criteria were accepted into the home. Meanwhile, Sarah Porter became an expert in legal matters, studying inheritance laws and probate procedures to ensure that the family's schemes would withstand scrutiny. Relationships with several Hartford lawyers were established by her, presenting herself as a devoted administrator who needed to understand legal procedures to better serve the home's residents. Unwittingly, these lawyers provided her with the knowledge she needed to create convincing forged documents. Their murder methods were also refined by the three Porters. With different drugs and dosages, Dr. Porter experimented, keeping detailed records of how each substance affected his victims. He discovered that a combination of morphine and laudanum could create symptoms that closely resembled natural senility, while small doses of arsenic could cause gradual organ failure that appeared to be age-related decline. Margaret Porter perfected the art of administering these substances in ways that appeared to be legitimate medical treatment. An elaborate system of false medical records was developed by her, documenting imaginary symptoms and treatments that would justify the drugs she was actually using to poison her victims. An air of professional competence that no one questioned was given to her actions by her nursing credentials. Throughout the late 1840s and early 1850s, the home's reputation continued to grow. Their stolen wealth was used by the Porters to enhance the facility's amenities, adding a library, a music room, and expanded gardens. They also began hosting elaborate charity events, inviting Hartford's social elite to tour the facility and witness the excellent care being provided to the elderly. Multiple purposes were served by these events. They reinforced the Porters' reputation as devoted Christian caretakers. They provided opportunities to identify wealthy potential victims, and they created a network of influential supporters who would defend the home against any future accusations. One of their most vocal advocates became Reverend Whitmore, regularly praising their work from the pulpit and encouraging his wealthiest parishioners to consider the home for their elderly relatives. But the most chilling aspect of this period was how the Porters began to enjoy their work. The hidden ledgers reveal that they had started rating their victims' deaths based on factors such as the amount of money stolen, the elegance of the murder method, and the convincingness of their performance as grieving caretakers. Detailed critiques of each murder were written by Dr. Porter, noting what had worked well and what could be improved in future cases. One particularly disturbing entry from 1849 described the death of Colonel James Hartford, a 68-year-old Revolutionary War veteran who had been slowly poisoned over a period of 6 months. Dr. Porter wrote, "Subject exhibited excellent cooperation during terminal phase. Arsenic dosage created perfect simulation of natural decline. Staff performance exemplary. Margaret's tears during final moments particularly convincing. Inheritance secured $73,500. Overall rating 9/10. Note: Colonel's military pension ceases upon death. Factor into future calculations. Into a business complete with performance evaluations and profit calculations, had the Porters transformed murder. A system so efficient and so well disguised had been created by them that they were able to operate with complete impunity for years. More disturbing still, they had convinced themselves that their crimes were justified by their religious mission, viewing each murder as a necessary sacrifice to fund their Christian charity. By 1850, the Sunset Years Christian Home had become one of Hartford's most respected institutions. Pillars of the community were the Porters, regular attendees at First Church of Christ and generous contributors to local charities. A public image that was the complete opposite of their private reality had been successfully created by them. But new challenges were also being created by their success. From some quarters, attention was beginning to be attracted by the steady stream of deaths at the home. Hartford's coroner, Dr. Samuel Harrison, had begun to notice that an unusually high number of death certificates were being signed by Dr. Porter. While individual cases appeared normal, the overall pattern was starting to seem suspicious. Compounded were Harrison's concerns by a troubling conversation he had with the local Catholic priest, Father Patrick O'Brien. O'Brien had mentioned that several families had contacted him about their elderly relatives who had died at the Sunset Years Christian Home. These families had been surprised to learn that their relatives had supposedly converted to Protestantism shortly before their deaths and had changed their wills to reflect their new religious convictions. Particularly significant were the priest's observations because they suggested that the Porters might be targeting Catholic residents, specifically using religious conversion as a cover for changing their victims' wills. A sectarian dimension to their crimes was added by this that could potentially create serious problems if it became public knowledge. More carefully, Dr. Harrison decided to investigate, but his efforts were hampered by the Porters' reputation and political connections. When he approached the city authorities with his concerns, he was told that the home was one of Hartford's most valuable institutions and that any investigation would need to be handled with extreme discretion. Meanwhile, through their network of supporters, the Porters had learned of Dr. Harrison's interest. Additional precautions were begun by them, spreading their victims' deaths over longer periods and varying their methods to avoid creating obvious patterns. They also began to cultivate Dr. Harrison directly, inviting him to tour the facility and praising his dedication to public health. By 1851, the threat posed by Dr. Harrison's investigation had been successfully neutralized by the Porters. They had convinced him that the high number of deaths at their facility was simply the result of their willingness to accept elderly residents that other institutions wouldn't take. By city officials who valued the home's contribution to the community more than they valued the coroner's suspicions, Harrison's concerns were dismissed. Their first serious challenge had been survived by the Porters, but the experience had taught them that their crimes were not entirely without risk. Even more sophisticated methods of concealment were begun by them, including the creation of false medical records that would justify their victims' deaths and the establishment of a network of corrupt officials who would protect them from future investigations. What none of them realized was that eventually, the instrument of their exposure would become their meticulous record-keeping. Enough evidence to convict them of every single murder they had committed was contained in the ledgers that Dr. Porter kept hidden beneath the floorboards. But for now, those ledgers remained safely hidden, and the Porters continued their deadly work with complete confidence in their ability to evade justice. The shadows of the past were growing longer, but the full darkness of their crimes was still hidden from the world. Actually, a Chamber of Horrors was Hartford's most respected Christian charity, and the community's most beloved caretakers were systematic killers who had turned murder into a profitable business model. An unexpected challenge to the Porters' carefully orchestrated operation was brought by the year 1853, one that would test their skills in ways they had never anticipated. It began with the arrival of Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, a 71-year-old widow whose circumstances seemed perfect for their purposes. She was wealthy, alone, and suffering from early stages of dementia that made her an ideal candidate for their systematic exploitation. The wife of a prominent Boston banker had been Mrs. Whitfield, and her estate was valued at over $200,000, by far the largest inheritance the Porters had ever targeted. Her only living relative was a nephew in San Francisco who had visited her perhaps twice in the past decade. By her longtime physician, Dr. Marcus Fleming, who had grown too old to continue caring for her complex medical needs, she had been referred to the Sunset Years Christian Home. Immediately upon her arrival, the Porters began their usual routine. Extensive interviews about her financial situation were conducted by Dr. Porter. Imaginary symptoms that would justify her eventual decline began to be documented by Margaret, and the legal requirements for claiming her inheritance started to be researched by Sarah. Everything appeared to be proceeding normally until they discovered something that changed everything. Despite her dementia, Mrs. Whitfield had an unusual habit of writing detailed letters to herself, a coping mechanism she had developed to deal with her memory loss. She would write about her daily activities, her thoughts, and her concerns, then read these letters the next day to remind herself of what had happened. As simply another symptom of her mental decline, the Porters initially viewed this, but they soon realized that these letters contained detailed observations about the home's operations. In one particularly troubling entry, Mrs. Whitfield had written, "The medicine Dr. Porter gives me makes me feel very strange. I sleep too much and cannot think clearly. Margaret seems kind, but I have noticed that she watches me very carefully when I take the medicine. I have seen her giving the same medicine to other residents, and several of them have died recently. I wonder if there is a connection." For the Porters, the discovery of these letters created a crisis. They had always been careful to ensure that their victims were too incapacitated to understand what was happening to them. But Mrs. Whitfield's letters suggested that she was more aware of her surroundings than they had realized. Worse still, she was documenting her observations in writing, creating a potential record of their crimes. The decision to accelerate Mrs. Whitfield's murder timeline was made by Dr. Porter, But this created new problems. The rapid increase in her morphine dosage caused her to become violently ill with symptoms that were clearly the result of drug poisoning rather than natural decline. The other residents noticed her sudden deterioration, and several staff members began asking questions about her treatment. In the difficult position of having to explain Mrs. Whitfield's condition to concerned staff members while simultaneously administering the drugs that were causing her illness found herself Margaret Porter. She claimed that Mrs. Whitfield was suffering from a rare form of dementia that caused sudden violent episodes and that the medications were necessary to prevent her from harming herself or others. But another troubling development compounded the staff's concerns. Mrs. Whitfield's original physician, Dr. Fleming, had decided to pay a surprise visit to check on her condition. He arrived on a day when Mrs. Whitfield was heavily sedated and barely conscious, a state that he immediately recognized as being inconsistent with her previous diagnosis. Several alarming symptoms were revealed by Dr. Fleming's medical examination: severe dehydration, dilated pupils, and a rapid irregular heartbeat that suggested drug intoxication rather than natural illness. When he questioned Dr. Porter about Mrs. Whitfield's treatment, he was told that her condition had deteriorated rapidly and that aggressive medication was necessary to control her symptoms. Not convinced by Dr. Porter's explanation was the visiting physician. He had treated Mrs. Whitfield for years and had never observed the violent episodes that Dr. Porter described. Moreover, her current symptoms were inconsistent with the progression of dementia and suggested the presence of external factors that were causing her decline. On reviewing Mrs. Whitfield's medical records, insisted Dr. Fleming, which created a new crisis for the Porters. Designed to justify her murder were the records that Margaret had created, but they contained inconsistencies and fabrications that would not withstand scrutiny by an experienced physician. In the unprecedented position of having to defend their medical decisions to a colleague who had superior knowledge of their victim's actual condition found themselves the Porters. In Dr. Porter's office, with Margaret and Sarah present as witnesses, took place the confrontation between the two physicians. Every aspect of Mrs. Whitfield's treatment was systematically challenged by Dr. Fleming, pointing out inconsistencies in the medical records and questioning the appropriateness of the medications being used. He demanded to know why Mrs. Whitfield had been given such large doses of morphine and why her family had not been notified of her deteriorating condition. With a masterful performance of professional indignation, responded Dr. Porter. He claimed that Dr. Fleming was questioning his competence based on outdated medical knowledge and that the treatments being used represented the latest advances in geriatric medicine. He pointed out that Mrs. Whitfield had been entrusted to his care by her family and that he had a legal and moral obligation to make treatment decisions based on his professional judgment. For over an hour, the argument continued, with both physicians citing medical literature and case studies to support their positions. Dr. Fleming insisted that Mrs. Whitfield's symptoms were inconsistent with natural disease progression, while Dr. Porter maintained that her condition was the result of rapid dementia complicated by age-related organ failure. Eventually, what he considered to be his trump card was played by Dr. Porter. He revealed that Mrs. Whitfield had expressed a desire to die peacefully and had asked him to ensure that her suffering would be minimized. He claimed that the morphine was being administered not as a cure but as palliative care to ease her transition to the next life. Perfectly with the Christian mission of the home fit this explanation, and it made it difficult for Dr. Fleming to continue his objections without appearing to be heartless. Forced to accept Dr. Porter's explanation was Dr. Fleming, but he made it clear that he would be monitoring Mrs. Whitfield's condition closely. He arranged to visit her twice weekly and insisted on receiving detailed reports about her treatment. Unprecedented in the Porters' experience was this level of scrutiny, and it created significant complications for their operation. That they could not continue with their original plan to murder Mrs. Whitfield while Dr. Fleming was monitoring her condition was realized by the Porters. They were forced to reduce her morphine dosage and allow her to recover somewhat while frantically searching for a way to eliminate the threat posed by the visiting physician. A solution that demonstrated the depths of their depravity was proposed by Sarah Porter. She suggested that they should arrange for Dr. Fleming to have an accident that would prevent him from continuing his visits. She had researched his daily routines and discovered that he walked alone to his office each morning along a route that passed through a construction site. It would be relatively easy to arrange for him to be struck by falling debris or to suffer a fall that would incapacitate him. The murder of Dr. Fleming was marked by the proposal to murder a new phase in the Porters' criminal evolution. They had moved beyond killing isolated elderly residents to considering the murder of a respected physician who posed a threat to their operation. The fact that they could contemplate such an action demonstrated how completely they had abandoned any pretense of moral restraint. Ultimately, Sarah's proposal was rejected by Dr. Porter, not because he was opposed to murdering Dr. Fleming, but because he believed the risks were too great. The death of a prominent physician would attract far more attention than the deaths of elderly residents, and there was a significant chance that an investigation would uncover their crimes. Instead, a different solution was proposed by him. They would allow Mrs. Whitfield to recover enough to satisfy Dr. Fleming's concerns, then find a way to discredit his medical judgment. Both elegant and ruthless was the Porters' solution. They gradually reduced Mrs. Whitfield's morphine dosage while simultaneously introducing small amounts of a different drug that would cause symptoms resembling heart disease. When Dr. Fleming arrived for his next visit, he found Mrs. Whitfield in significantly better condition, with her previous symptoms having been replaced by what appeared to be cardiac irregularities. That Mrs. Whitfield's improvement was the result of adjusting her medications based on Dr. Fleming's recommendations was explained by Dr. Porter. He claimed that the cardiac symptoms were a new development that required immediate attention and that he had already begun treatment with Digitalis, a standard medication for heart conditions. Medically plausible was the explanation, and it demonstrated that Dr. Porter had taken Dr. Fleming's concerns seriously. With Mrs. Whitfield's improvement was satisfied Dr. Fleming, and he praised Dr. Porter for his responsive treatment. He agreed to reduce the frequency of his visits to once weekly, which gave the Porters more flexibility in their operations. Most importantly, he had been convinced that his initial concerns had been unfounded and that Mrs. Whitfield was receiving appropriate care. What Dr. Fleming didn't realize was that as part of their new murder plan, the cardiac symptoms were being artificially induced by the Porters. The Digitalis that Dr. Porter was supposedly using to treat her heart condition was actually being administered in doses that would gradually cause heart failure. The method was slower than their usual morphine overdoses, but it was virtually undetectable and would appear to be the result of natural age-related decline. Of apparent heart failure died Mrs. Whitfield 6 weeks later, with Dr. Fleming present to witness her peaceful passing. Without hesitation, he signed the death certificate, noting that her death was consistent with the cardiac symptoms he had observed during his visits. Their most challenging victim had been successfully murdered by the Porters while convincing the investigating physician that they were providing excellent care. Tremendous confidence in their abilities was given to the Porters by the successful elimination of Mrs. Whitfield despite Dr. Fleming's scrutiny. They had proven that they could adapt their methods to meet any challenge and that their skills in deception were sophisticated enough to fool even experienced medical professionals. The $200,000 inheritance that they stole from Mrs. Whitfield's estate was by far their largest single theft, and it provided them with the resources to expand their operations even further. But something troubling about the Porters' psychological state was also revealed by the Mrs. Whitfield case. The hidden ledgers show that they had begun to take pride in the complexity of their crimes and the sophistication of their deceptions. Extensive analyses of each challenge they faced and the methods they used to overcome them were written by Dr. Porter, treating their murders as intellectual puzzles rather than acts of violence. Complete was the transformation of the Porters from opportunistic killers to sophisticated criminal masterminds. They had developed the skills, the resources, and the psychological detachment necessary to continue their crimes indefinitely. What they didn't realize was that the conditions that would eventually lead to their exposure were being created by their very success. By 1865, the Porters had been operating their murderous enterprise for 20 years, and their success had made them increasingly bold and careless. New opportunities had been brought by the end of the Civil War as veterans returned to Hartford with war-related injuries and pensions, creating a fresh population of vulnerable elderly residents. As particularly valuable targets saw the Porters these men because their military service had earned them community respect, making their deaths less likely to be questioned. During this period, they encountered Captain Ezra Blackwood, a 62-year-old Union Army veteran who had been severely wounded at Gettysburg. His left arm had been lost by Captain Blackwood in the battle, and shrapnel wounds had left him with chronic pain that required regular medical attention. A substantial military pension had been awarded to him, and his years of service had earned him a sizable savings account. More importantly, he had no living family and few social connections, making him an ideal candidate for the Porters' scheme. But different from their previous victims in ways that the Porters failed to recognize was Captain Blackwood. His military experience had made him naturally suspicious of authority figures, and his years of command had taught him to observe details that others might miss. From his first day at the Sunset Years Christian Home, he began to notice patterns in the facility's operations that troubled him. That several residents had experienced rapid declines in their health shortly after arriving at the home was observed by Captain Blackwood. He noticed that Dr. Porter spent an unusual amount of time discussing financial matters with residents and that Margaret Porter seemed to administer medications more frequently than seemed medically necessary. Most disturbing of all, he realized that the home's mortality rate was significantly higher than would be expected for a facility of its size and reputation. The importance of gathering intelligence before taking action had been taught to the captain by his military training. His own investigation was begun by him, carefully documenting his observations and quietly questioning other residents about their experiences. What he discovered convinced him that something criminal was happening at the home, though he was not yet certain about the full scope of the Porters' activities. Complicated was Captain Blackwood's investigation by the fact that he was beginning to experience symptoms that he suspected were caused by his medications. For his chronic pain, Dr. Porter had prescribed laudanum, but the captain noticed that the drug was making him increasingly confused and disoriented. He began to suspect that he was being deliberately drugged, and he started to hide his medications instead of taking them. For the Porters, problems were created by the captain's refusal to take his prescribed medications. Without the drugs to incapacitate him, he remained alert and suspicious, making it impossible for them to proceed with their usual murder method. Dr. Porter attempted to convince him that the medications were necessary for his health, but Captain Blackwood insisted that he felt better without them. More complicated became the situation when Captain Blackwood began to share his suspicions with other residents. Individuals who seemed trustworthy and mentally alert were carefully selected by him, gradually building a network of allies who could help him investigate the home's operations. Their most serious threat yet, an organized resistance movement among their intended victims, were the Porters realizing that they were facing. The extent of Captain Blackwood's activities was discovered by Margaret Porter when she intercepted a letter he had written to his former commanding officer. In the letter, the captain described his suspicions about the home's operations and requested assistance in investigating possible criminal activity. He mentioned specific residents who had died under suspicious circumstances and provided details about the medications being administered to residents. For the Porters, a potential catastrophe was represented by the letter. If Captain Blackwood's former commanding officer took his concerns seriously and contacted authorities, it could trigger the investigation that they had managed to avoid for 20 years. The letter also revealed that the captain had been gathering evidence systematically, suggesting that he possessed information that could expose their crimes. That Captain Blackwood had to be eliminated immediately was realized by Dr. Porter, but the circumstances made their usual methods impractical. The captain was too alert to be easily poisoned, and his suspicious nature made it impossible to convince him to take medications voluntarily. Moreover, his military background meant that his sudden death would likely attract attention from army investigators, who would be more thorough than local authorities. A method they had never attempted before was decided to be used by the Porters. They would stage an accident that would eliminate Captain Blackwood while making his death appear to be the result of his war injuries. That they could arrange for the captain to fall down the home's main staircase was proposed by Sarah Porter, claiming that his missing arm had caused him to lose his balance. The fall would be blamed on his disability and his death would be viewed as a tragic accident rather than a murder. Careful timing and coordination were required by the plan. The Porters waited until a stormy night when the home staff would be distracted by other duties. With a syringe containing a powerful sedative, Dr. Porter approached Captain Blackwood's room, intending to incapacitate him before staging the fall. But for such an attack, the captain was prepared. When Dr. Porter entered his room, Captain Blackwood was waiting behind the door with a walking stick raised as a weapon. Briefly, the two men struggled, with the captain using his military training to overcome the doctor's attempt to inject him with the sedative. The fight ended when Captain Blackwood struck Dr. Porter with the walking stick, causing him to drop the syringe and flee the room. The porter's intentions were confirmed by the failed attack to be Captain Blackwood's worst suspicions. He realized that his life was in immediate danger and that he needed to escape from the home before they could make another attempt on his life. But the captain also understood that simply fleeing would not solve the problem. The porters would continue killing other residents unless someone stopped them. A decision that would prove to be both courageous and fatal was made by Captain Blackwood. Instead of escaping immediately, he chose to remain at the home long enough to gather the evidence needed to expose the porter's crimes. He knew that his accusations alone would not be sufficient to convince authorities, especially given the porter's reputation in the community. Proof that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away was needed by him. To obtain samples of the medications being administered to residents and to document the porter's methods in sufficient detail to support criminal charges was the captain's plan. Through the home undetected, he used his military skills to move, searching offices and medical supply rooms for evidence of the poisoning operation. What he discovered exceeded even his worst fears. In Dr. Porter's private office, hidden behind medical texts, Captain Blackwood found vials of morphine, arsenic, and other deadly substances that had no legitimate medical purpose in a home for the elderly. He also discovered forged documents, including blank wills and death certificates that could be used to steal residents' inheritances. Most damning of all, he found a partial list of residents who had died at the home along with notations about the amounts of money inherited by the facility. His findings were carefully documented by Captain Blackwood, creating detailed notes about each piece of evidence and its location within the home. To military authorities who would have the power to conduct a thorough investigation, he planned to present this information. But as he prepared to leave the home with his evidence, what he had been doing was discovered by the porters. In Dr. Porter's office, just as he was photographing the incriminating documents with a small camera he had obtained for intelligence gathering purposes, was found the captain by Sarah Porter. Unlike anything the porters had experienced before was the confrontation that followed. His activities, or to negotiate for his safety, did not attempt to deny Captain Blackwood. Instead, he calmly informed Sarah that he had already sent copies of his evidence to military authorities and that his death would only confirm their worst suspicions. That the situation had spiraled completely out of control was realized by Sarah Porter. No longer were the porters dealing with isolated elderly victims who could be eliminated quietly. They were facing a trained military investigator who had systematically documented their crimes and had taken steps to ensure that his evidence would survive his death. For the first time in 20 years, the real possibility of exposure and prosecution was faced by the porters. When Dr. Porter returned to his office and discovered the confrontation between Sarah and Captain Blackwood, the crisis deepened. The captain's calm demeanor and obvious preparation convinced the doctor that their situation was far more serious than he had initially realized. Comprehensive enough to destroy them was the evidence that the captain had gathered, and his claims about having contacted military authorities could not be dismissed as bluffing. A desperate decision that revealed how completely the 20 years of murder had corrupted his judgment was made by Dr. Porter. Instead of attempting to negotiate with Captain Blackwood or to flee before authorities arrived, he chose to eliminate the threat by committing the most brazen murder of his career. A pistol was retrieved by him from his desk drawer and shot Captain Blackwood 3 times in the chest, killing him instantly. Throughout the home, the gunshots were heard, creating immediate chaos among residents and staff. Within minutes, Margaret Porter arrived, followed by several terrified residents who demanded to know what had happened. That Captain Blackwood had attacked him and that the shooting had been in self-defense was attempted to be claimed by Dr. Porter, but his explanation was contradicted by the evidence in the room. The presence of the incriminating documents, the camera, and Captain Blackwood's detailed notes made it impossible to present his death as anything other than murder. Moreover, the captain's body showed no signs of having attacked anyone, and the gun had been fired from close range in a manner consistent with execution rather than self-defense. Finally, a crime that could not be explained away or covered up had been committed by the porters. The beginning of the end for the Porters' criminal empire was marked by the immediate aftermath of Captain Blackwood's murder. By neighbors, the gunshots had been heard, and within hours Hartford police arrived at the home to investigate reports of violence. Their facade of respectability was attempted to be maintained by the Porters, claiming that the shooting had been a tragic accident involving a disturbed veteran who had suffered from war-related mental illness. But inconsistencies in their story were quickly revealed by the police investigation. In Dr. Porter's office, along with the weapons and forged documents that proved the existence of a systematic murder operation, was discovered Captain Blackwood's evidence. A roadmap for uncovering 20 years of crimes that had been hidden behind a facade of Christian charity was provided to investigators by the captain's detailed notes. The most extensive criminal investigation in Hartford's history was triggered by the discovery of Captain Blackwood's evidence. The entire facility was searched by police, discovering hidden caches of poison, forged documents, and financial records that documented the theft of hundreds of thousands of dollars from murdered residents. The existence of the hidden ledgers that contained Dr. Porter's detailed records of each murder was also revealed by the investigation. Through Hartford, as word of the investigation spread, families began to come forward with questions about relatives who had died at the Sunset Years Christian home. Consistent with Captain Blackwood's findings was the pattern that emerged. Dozens of wealthy, isolated elderly individuals had died under suspicious circumstances, and their inheritances had been stolen through forged documents. The end of one of the most successful criminal enterprises in American history was marked by the Porters' arrest on charges of multiple murder and fraud. But even as they faced prosecution, they continued to maintain their innocence, claiming that they had been devoted Christian caretakers who had been victimized by a disturbed military veteran with paranoid delusions. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Hartford intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. On October 15, 1879, the trial of Dr. William Porter, Margaret Porter, and Sarah Porter began in what the Hartford Courant called the most sensational criminal proceeding in Connecticut's history. Packed with spectators, journalists, and family members of the Porters' victims was the courtroom, creating an atmosphere of barely controlled outrage that threatened to erupt into violence at any moment. Months preparing his case had been spent by prosecutor James Mitchell, using Captain Blackwood's evidence as the foundation for charges that included 189 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. Around three key pieces of evidence was built the prosecution's case: the hidden ledgers that documented each murder, the physical evidence of poisons and forged documents found in the home, and the testimony of surviving staff members who had witnessed suspicious activities. The most damning evidence against the Porters proved to be the ledgers. An incredibly detailed confession that documented not only the methods used to murder each victim, but also the financial calculations that had motivated each crime had been created by Dr. Porter's meticulous record-keeping. Entries such as Mrs. Sarah Caldwell. Arsenic administered over 6 weeks. Symptoms consistent with natural decline. Will forged successfully. Inheritance $67,400. Total time investment 8 weeks. Profit per week $8,125. Excellent return on effort. Were contained in the ledgers. Even experienced court observers were shocked by the clinical detachment revealed in these entries. Not only had the Porters murdered their victims systematically, but they had treated each murder as a business transaction, complete with cost-benefit analyses and performance evaluations. That they had developed elaborate rating systems for their crimes, judging each murder based on factors such as profitability, difficulty, and the quality of their deceptive performance was revealed by the ledgers. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the evidence that the Porters had taken pleasure in their work. Frequently, Dr. Porter's entries included personal observations about their victims suffering, with comments such as subject exhibited amusing confusion during final days and Margaret's performance as grieving caretaker particularly convincing during last visits from family. Note: tears on command remain an excellent technique for deflecting suspicion. Testimony from Dr. Samuel Harrison, the coroner, who had been suspicious of the home's high mortality rate years earlier, was also presented by the prosecution. About his attempts to investigate the facility and how the Porters had successfully deflected his concerns through their political connections and community reputation, testified Dr. Harrison. That the Porters' crimes could have been stopped much earlier if authorities had been willing to investigate their suspicions more thoroughly was revealed by his testimony. Crucial testimony about the Porters' methods was provided by staff members who had worked at the home. That she had noticed Margaret Porter administering medications to residents at unusual times and in doses that seemed excessive for their conditions, testified nurse Elizabeth Hartwell. She also testified about overhearing conversations between the three Porters about residents' financial situations and their lack of family connections. About strange activities he had observed on the home's property provided testimony by groundskeeper Thomas Murphy. He described seeing the Porters burying objects in the gardens late at night, and he testified about finding burned documents in the facility's furnace that appeared to be legal papers. That the Porters had been systematically destroying evidence of their crimes for years was helped to be established by his testimony. An almost impossible task was faced by the defense team, led by prominent Hartford attorney Charles Whitman. Overwhelming was the evidence against the Porters, and their clients' own records provided detailed confessions to every crime they were accused of committing. To argue that the Porters had been driven insane by their religious fanaticism and that their crimes were the result of mental illness rather than criminal intent was Whitman's strategy. From alienists who claimed that the Porters suffered from a form of religious mania that had distorted their moral judgment was presented expert testimony by Whitman. That the three defendants genuinely believed they were performing God's work by ending the suffering of elderly residents and using their inheritances to fund Christian charity was argued by the defense. According to this theory, evidence of their delusional belief that they were accountable to God for their actions were the detailed records they kept. That the Porters admit they had committed the murders was required by the insanity defense, which created dramatic moments in the courtroom when each defendant was forced to acknowledge their crimes. That he had killed residents because he believed God had called him to end their suffering and to use their wealth for righteous purposes, testified Dr. Porter. Chilling in its calm rationality was his testimony as he explained his methods and motivations without showing any sign of remorse or recognition that his actions had been wrong. Even more disturbing was Margaret Porter's testimony. As acts of mercy, she described the murders, claiming that she had felt divinely inspired when administering the fatal doses of poison to her victims. That she had prayed over each victim as they died, asking God to forgive them for their sins and to welcome them into eternal rest was testified by her. Even the defense attorneys were shocked by her complete lack of recognition that she had committed crimes. The calculating nature of their operation was revealed by Sarah Porter's testimony. To forging wills and stealing inheritances, she admitted, but claimed that she had been following God's will in redirecting wealth from selfish individuals to charitable purposes. About the research she had conducted into victims' financial situations and family relationships testified she, describing these activities as part of her divine mission to identify suitable candidates for merciful release. The flaws in the insanity defense were exposed by the prosecution's cross-examination of the defendants. That the Porters' actions had been carefully planned and executed with full awareness of their illegal nature was demonstrated by Prosecutor Mitchell. To their efforts to avoid detection, their destruction of evidence, and their attempts to manipulate investigations as proof that they had understood the criminal nature of their actions was pointed by him. From the ledgers themselves came the most damaging evidence against the insanity defense. That the Porters had been motivated by greed rather than religious delusion was proved by the detailed financial calculations and performance evaluations. That they had approached their crimes as a business enterprise rather than as acts of religious devotion was demonstrated by the clinical nature of their record-keeping. That the Porters had lived luxuriously on their stolen wealth, using their victims' money to purchase expensive clothing, jewelry, and furnishings for their private quarters was also presented as evidence by Mitchell. That they had stolen inheritances solely to fund charitable activities was contradicted by this evidence, proving that they had been motivated by personal greed. When Mitchell read aloud from Dr. Porter's final ledger entry written just days before Captain Blackwood's murder, came the trial's most dramatic moment. 20 years of successful operations have proven the viability of our method. We have perfected the art of profitable death, combining religious respectability with systematic exploitation. Our victims die believing they are loved while we acquire the wealth to expand our sacred mission. God has blessed our work with remarkable success, and we are prepared to continue indefinitely. Note: consider expansion to other cities. Hartford market becoming saturated. An uproar in the courtroom was created by the reading of this entry, with family members of victims shouting accusations at the defendants and demanding immediate justice. Multiple recesses were forced to be called by Judge Morrison to restore order, and he threatened to clear the courtroom if spectators could not control their emotions. For only 3 hours, the jury deliberated before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against all 3 defendants. The overwhelming nature of the evidence and the horror that the community felt about the Porters' crimes was reflected by the speed of their deliberation. When the verdicts were read, no emotion was shown by the defendants, maintaining the same cold detachment that had characterized their crimes. Each of the defendants to death by hanging was sentenced by Judge Morrison, describing their crimes as the most heinous and calculated murders in the history of this state. That their abuse of their positions as trusted caretakers had made their crimes particularly despicable was noted by him, and he expressed his hope that their execution would serve as a warning to others who might consider similar crimes. A scathing condemnation of the Porters' attempt to justify their crimes through religious delusion was included in the judge's sentencing statement. "You have blasphemed against the very faith you claim to serve, using the sacred trust placed in you by this Christian community to commit acts of unparalleled evil. Your crimes have not only taken the lives of innocent victims, but have shaken the faith of all who believed in the sanctity of Christian charity." The complete contradiction between their public image and their private reality had been exposed by the revelation of the Porters' true motivations. They had spent 20 years building reputations as devoted Christian caretakers while simultaneously operating the most successful murder enterprise in American history. Not only criminal skill, but also a level of psychological manipulation that stunned even experienced investigators had been required by their ability to maintain this deception for so long. That the Sunset Years Christian Home had been a carefully constructed facade designed to provide cover for systematic murder and theft had been revealed by the trial. Every aspect of the facility's operations, from its religious mission to its charitable activities, had been calculated to create an environment where wealthy elderly residents could be exploited and killed without arousing suspicion. That Americans' respect for Christian charity would make them reluctant to investigate accusations against religious institutions had been understood by the Porters' crimes had succeeded for so long because they had. To create the perfect environment for their criminal enterprise had been done by them by exploiting the community's faith and trust, proving that even the most sacred institutions could be corrupted by human greed and evil. As the defendants were led away to await execution, the full scope of their crimes was still being uncovered. 189 confirmed victims had been identified by investigators, but they suspected that the actual number might be higher. At over $3 million was estimated the financial damage, making the Porters' operation one of the most profitable criminal enterprises in American history. Not only their individual crimes, but also the systemic failures that had allowed them to operate with impunity for 20 years, had been exposed by the trial of the Porter family. Significant reforms in the oversight of charitable institutions would be led to by the case and would create new legal requirements for the investigation of suspicious deaths in care facilities. On December 15, 1879, in the courtyard of the Hartford County Jail, the executions of Dr. William Porter, Margaret Porter, and Sarah Porter took place. Despite the early morning hour, hundreds of spectators gathered outside the jail to witness the final chapter of what newspapers had dubbed the Christian Home murders. To the end, their composure was maintained by the 3 defendants, with Dr. Porter delivering a final statement that shocked observers with its complete lack of remorse. "We have served God faithfully," declared Dr. Porter from the gallows. "And we go to our reward knowing that our work has been misunderstood by those who lack the vision to see divine purpose in earthly suffering. The money we acquired was used for Christian purposes. And the deaths we administered were merciful releases from the pain of earthly existence. History will vindicate our actions when mankind evolves to understand true Christian charity." Equally chilling were Margaret Porter's final words, I have eased the suffering of 189 souls and guided them gently into God's embrace. Each death was an act of love performed with prayer and compassion. I regret only that we were prevented from continuing our sacred mission to help more elderly souls find peace. Silent until the moment before the trapdoor opened remained Sarah Porter, when she whispered a prayer that was heard by the attending minister. Lord, forgive them, for they know not what they do. They have stopped your servants from performing your work, but your will shall be done through others who understand true mercy. At exactly 7 a.m., the executions were carried out simultaneously, with all 3 defendants dying quickly and without struggle. In unmarked graves in Hartford's Potter's Field were buried their bodies, as no cemetery would accept them and no religious denomination would claim them. No monuments to their crimes, no shrines where the curious or the disturbed might come to pay homage to their twisted legacy was wanted by the city. 4 months after their execution, the investigation into the Porters' crimes continued as authorities worked to identify all of their victims and to return stolen property to surviving family members. By the Porters' sophisticated methods of concealment and the passage of time since many of the murders had been committed was complicated the process. Ultimately, 189 murders were confirmed by investigators and identified an additional 23 suspicious deaths that could not be definitively proven to be homicides. That the Porters had stolen approximately $3.2 million from their victims, an enormous sum that would be equivalent to tens of millions of dollars in modern currency, was revealed by the financial investigation. On expanding and maintaining the Sunset Years Christian home had been spent most of this money, but significant amounts had also been used to purchase luxury items for the Porters' personal use and to make donations to religious organizations throughout Connecticut. A crisis of conscience for Hartford's religious community was created by the discovery that respected churches had unknowingly accepted donations funded by murder money. Donations they had received from the Porters were returned by several congregations, while others struggled with the ethical implications of using tainted money for charitable purposes. For years, the religious community was divided by the controversy, and new policies requiring detailed documentation of large donations were led to. In the spring of 1880, after city authorities determined that the building had become too infamous to serve any useful purpose, was demolished the Sunset Years Christian home itself. To developers who built modest residences on the site was sold the property. But for decades afterward, with its association with the murders, struggled the neighborhood. Depressed remained property values, and many residents reported feeling uncomfortable living where so many innocent people had died. On the regulation of care facilities throughout the United States, profound effects were had by the Porter case. The first comprehensive laws requiring government oversight of charitable institutions were passed by Connecticut, mandating regular inspections and background checks for operators of care facilities. With similar legislation, other states followed, creating a regulatory framework that continues to govern institutional care today. In inheritance law and probate procedures, significant changes were also led to by the case. For witnessing wills, verifying the mental competence of testators, and investigating suspicious bequests to charitable organizations were established new requirements. Much more difficult for future criminals to use forged documents to steal inheritances from vulnerable elderly victims were made by these reforms. Perhaps most importantly, public attitudes toward institutional care for the elderly were changed by the Porter case. About placing elderly relatives in residential facilities became much more cautious families, and new expectations for transparency and accountability from charitable organizations were developed by communities. By healthy skepticism and demand for oversight was replaced the blind trust that had allowed the Porters to operate with impunity for 20 years. On Hartford's residents, profound and lasting was the psychological impact of the Porter case. Their memories of the Porters as respected community members with the reality of their crimes was struggled to be reconciled by many people. Neighbors who had socialized with the family, parishioners who had worshipped alongside them, and community leaders who had praised their charitable work, all faced the disturbing realization that they had been completely deceived by master manipulators. A prominent advocate for medical ethics and professional accountability became Dr. Samuel Harrison, the coroner, who had first suspected that something was wrong at the home. The remainder of his career was spent by him developing guidelines for investigating suspicious deaths and training other medical professionals to recognize signs of systematic abuse. That future cases of medical murder would be detected and investigated more quickly was helped to be ensured by his work. Their own struggles with guilt and trauma were faced by the staff members who had worked at the Sunset Years Christian Home. That they were working for a charitable organization had been genuinely believed by many of them and were devastated to learn that they had unknowingly participated in a murder operation. To cope with their experiences, psychological treatment was required by several former employees and some never worked in healthcare again. A complex mix of emotions following the trial and executions was experienced by the families of the Porter's victims. While some satisfaction in seeing justice served was found by them, about their elderly relatives' final days and their own failure to recognize the danger their loved ones had faced was struggled with questions by many. To help these families process their grief and anger were formed support groups, creating some of the first organized victim advocacy efforts in American history. On American journalism and true crime literature, significant effects were also had by the Porter case. New standards for crime reporting were established by the extensive newspaper coverage of the trial, and one of the first major criminal stories to be covered by correspondents from multiple cities became the case. Within months of the executions, books about the case were published, beginning a tradition of true crime literature that continues today. As an opportunity to examine the relationship between faith and criminal behavior was used the Porter case by religious leaders throughout the country. About the dangers of false prophets and the importance of distinguishing between genuine Christian charity and exploitation disguised as religious service were preached sermons. About the potential for evil to hide behind facades of respectability and religious devotion became a cautionary tale. The case. Significant was also the architectural legacy of the case. For destroying buildings associated with notorious crimes, a precedent was established by the demolition of the Sunset Years Christian Home, and many other infamous structures were subsequently torn down to prevent them from becoming sites of morbid fascination. Society's desire to erase physical reminders of extreme evil and to prevent the glorification of criminal behavior was reflected by this practice. By the sophistication and longevity of their criminal operation continue to be amazed modern investigators and historians who have studied the Porter case. The combination of medical knowledge, legal expertise, and psychological manipulation that the Porters employed was remarkably advanced for its time and would be impressive even by contemporary standards. One of the most successful criminal enterprises in American history is represented by their ability to maintain their deception for 20 years while committing nearly 200 murders. In criminal psychology, an important study has also become the case, particularly in understanding how seemingly normal individuals can become capable of systematic murder. Valuable insights into the criminal mind and the process of moral corruption are provided by the Porters' gradual descent into evil, their ability to rationalize their crimes through religious delusion, and their development of increasingly sophisticated methods of concealment. How easily evil can disguise itself behind facades of respectability and religious devotion is shown to us by this mystery, and how important it is to question authority and demand accountability from those who claim to serve our communities. That the most dangerous criminals are often those we trust most and that vigilance is the price of safety in any civilized society is reminded to us by the Porter family's crimes. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about the Porters' operation, or might there have been additional crimes that were never discovered? The meticulous nature of their record-keeping suggests they documented everything, but the possibility remains that some of their earliest victims were never identified. Leave your comment below and share your theories about what other secrets might have died with the Porter family. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe. Hit the notification bell and share with someone who loves mysteries as dark and twisted as this one. The shadows of the past hold many more secrets and we'll continue to uncover them together. See you in the next video where we'll explore another tale of hidden evil that will make you question everything you think you know about human nature.